I would like to invite now the Marius Zemp for the presentation revisiting the development of phonemic tone, tonogenesis in Tibetic languages. And so I think, Jonathan, can you make him the co-host for that? I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay, you should be able to share now.
Okay, let's try. Is it okay if I start?
I think so, yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Marius Zemp from the
We
University of Bern in Switzerland.
The presentation.
We don't see the presentation.
Together with you, based on our knowledge. You can't see the presentation?
No, we can hear it, but we cannot see.
Do you see down there? It says there's a big green button at the bottom of the Zoom window. It should say share screen.
Exactly. Sorry, forgot about that. Yeah.
No problem.
All right. Thank you. Does that look better now? Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Please.
Okay. So I'm going to try again. Hi, everybody. I'm Marius Zemp from the University of Bern in Switzerland. And I'm going to revisit together with you the development of phonemic tone or tonogenesis in Tibetic languages. Based on our knowledge of various divergent phonological systems of modern Tibetic dialects, we are able to reconstruct a number of facts about the Tibetic tonogenesis. We are able to clearly trace how registered tone becomes distinctive in one after another context, affecting one after another portion of the vocabulary of these languages. The Tibetic tonogenesis thus wonderfully illustrates the graduality of phonological changes. So what we'll do is retrace how phonemic tone developed in Central and Tibetic dialects first. Then we'll identify a proto-stage in which pitch was not yet phonologically distinctive. And then I will present hypotheses as to how pitch may have become phonologically distinctive. On this map, you can see that only the Tibetic dialects in the center, within the blue line here, have developed tones. They are traditionally called tonal dialects or tonal varieties. No tones developed in the dialects spoken in the periphery, called non-tonal. We will deal with both groups in the following. The main development of the tonal Tibetic varieties is well understood and borne out by cross-linguistic phonetic studies such as Humbert, Ohala, and Ewan, 1979. So syllables starting with an originally voiced onset have developed a low tone. Those starting with a voiceless onset have developed a high tone. Jackson Sun illustrates this for Lhasa Tibetan. Superscript H represents a high tone, L a low tone. So in Lhasa, voiceless onsets led to a high tone, voiced onsets, whether prefixed or not, to low tone. But whereas prefixless voiced initials led to low syllables with voiceless initials throughout the tonal dialects, prefixed voiced plosive initials developed in various ways in different dialects. Crucial for the understanding of all these developments is that both oral and nasal prefixes preserve the voicedness of initials. Voiced stops could become devoiced only after dropping their prefix. Note that we traditionally distinguish between oral and nasal prefixes. The X stands for the different oral prefixes, which you have listed on this slide, and the N stands for the nasal prefixes. We'll be focusing on the oral prefixes for some time now. So in this Tibetic variety spoken in Yushu Prefecture and Qinghai, for instance, syllables with unprefixed voiced onsets developed into a low register, whereas those with prefixed voiced onsets developed into a mid-high register. In Dige, another Tibetic variety, prefixed voiced onsets have led to high register according to one source, and to unstable, one can pronounce them either in the high tone or in the low tone, according to another. Katrin Hasler, in the appendix of her 1999 Grammar of Dige, elaborates on this unstable tone of syllables, which originally had prefixed voiced onsets. According to Hasler, the written Tibetan voiced radicals with pre and or superscribed letters, so with prefixes in general, have not yet been devoiced. Only the written Tibetan non-prefixed voiced radicals have been devoiced. And it is also only the latter, the non-prefixed radicals, which have developed tone, as you can see in the lower line. So Hasler writes that we could expect the syllables with a voiced initial deriving from a written Tibetan prefix voiced radical also to carry a low tone. They have, after all, a phonetic predisposition to do so. Yet, interestingly, we find in the literature on the Dige dialect repeatedly and by different authors syllables with a voiced initial stop and a high tone. It is remarkable that the data on high tone syllables with voiced initials is not very consistent. Different authors contradict each other, and even in one and the same source, contradictions may be found. Here are just some of the contradictions found in the literature on Com dialects, which Hasler collected. The unstable tone of written Tibetan prefixed voiced initials also shows in Hasler's box plots, comparing the pitch or fundamental frequency of syllables with different onsets in written Tibetan. Syllables which originally had prefixed voiced initials shown in the lower right corner have a much greater dispersion than any of the other onsets. But according to Hasler, the plots also show that they nevertheless have a tendency to be low. Quote Hasler again, "This supports the hypothesis that from a synchronic perspective, the tone on a syllable with a voiced initial is not distinctive in the modern Dige dialect and can vary freely, though it has a clear tendency towards a low tone." Her diachronic explanation runs as follows. Tone in Dige develops in parallel to the devoicing of the WT radical. Syllables whose initial consonant has already been devoiced carry a phonemic and low tone. These are basically the syllables which have a simple voiced radical in written Tibetan. Syllables that have not yet been devoiced have also not yet developed a phonemic tone. These are the syllables where written Tibetan voiced radical is preceded by a pre-radical. Hasler goes on to compare Dige Com with two central Tibetic varieties and observes Dige seems to be the slowest dialect among these three as far as devoicing is concerned, while in Shigatse, all the initial stops have been devoiced, and Girong only former prenasalized initials are still voiced. Dige still keeps the voicing on all former prefixed voiced initials. But as we have seen, Dige is on its way towards a similar system as Girong by also devoicing the former prefixed voiced initials. Accordingly, in the Dige dialect, the word with a WT voiced initial cluster must carry a distinctive low tone if it is almost or totally devoiced. When the voicing is still there, tone is not distinctive. Let us now have a brief closer look at what happened in Girong, represented in Hasler's comparison on the previous slide. As we saw in slide 16, Girong went further than Dige in devoicing not only unprefixed voiced stops, but also voiced stops with oral prefixes. However, according to Brigitte Huber now, these onset clusters in Girong developed an extra low tone, or a tone with breathy voice, while those low tones which had previously developed from prefixless initial stops were pushed to a mid-high register, or a low tone without breathy voice. Let us summarize the various developments which prefixed voiced onsets underwent in different dialects. So they developed into mid-high tones, into high tones, into free or unstable tones, into low tones, and even into extra low tones with breathy voice. What we firmly seem to know is that in Digi, written Tibetan voiced stops with oral prefixes, highlighted in orange, lost this prefix, but have not yet fully lost their voiceness. Accordingly, the tone of these syllables has remained free, but tends to be low, especially when voiceness is reduced. In Girong, the same syllables lost their prefix and became devoiced, received low tone and breathy voice, and pushed pre-existing low syllables deriving from unprefixed voiced stops to a mid-high register, see the upper row. And in Lhasa and Chigatse, the same syllables also lost their prefix, became devoiced and low, like the voiced stops with nasal prefixes, while previously devoiced and low syllables deriving from unprefixed voiced stops became aspirated. See the upper row again. In the lower row, you can see that stops preceded by nasal prefixes remain voiced in both Digi and Girong. In Digi, the prenasalization was also preserved. Prefixes thus protect the voicedness of following initials. When prefixes are dropped one after another, oral before nasal prefix, the voicedness of the initials is also neutralized step by step, while pitch becomes distinctive instead. Hence, pitch becomes distinctive in one after another group of words with certain onsets, and thus gradually spreads across the vocabulary. Keeping this in mind, we will now make a step further into the past by turning to disyllabic nouns, or nonverbs. In apparently all tonal dialects, we observe the following neutralization. This is from Nancy Kaplow's work now. Tokpegola Tibetan is a tonal variety spoken in eastern Nepal, but we find this neutralization in all the dialects discussed above. So written Tibetan onsets, shown in the third column, which develop a low tone in monosyllabic nonverbs, or in the first syllable of disyllabic nonverbs, shown in the second column, always become high-toned in the second syllable of disyllabic nonverbs. Example B, for instance, we have a low-toned word da, arrow, which becomes high when as soon as it's in the second syllable of the compound, menda. So throughout the tonal Tibetic varieties, the second syllable of disyllabic nouns is always, even if it originally began with a voiced obstruent, higher than the first syllable. That is, we find LH and HH, but neither LL nor H. Kaplow's robust statistical analysis of the acoustic correlative stress in two non-tone varieties in the opposite peripheries of the Tibetic language continuum, Balti in the west and Rekong Amdo in the east, shows that first, disyllabic nonverbs are consistently stressed there on the second syllable. Second, this stress is primarily conveyed by fundamental frequency. Assuming that this was already the case in Proto-Tibetan, explains the absence of LL and HL in the tonal varieties. So let us look at some of the minimal pairs we find in Balti and Purik in the western periphery, that is, pairs of words primarily distinguished by pitch. While the second syllable of verbal infinitives is unstressed and typically lower than the first syllable, in the disyllabic nouns, disyllabic nouns with identical segmental material, pitch is consistently higher on the second syllable. So we have the verb kurba, but the noun kurba, or the verb khlatba, but the noun khlatba. Hence, ba, ba, ma is unstressed and as an infinitive marker, unstressed as an infinitive marker, a productive grammatical formant, but high when part of a lexicalized and unanalyzable noun. And a few minimal pairs from neighboring Burik. From my own work, it's marpo means red, but marpo is the butter. And serpo is yellow, but serpo is the gold. Hence, in disyllabic nouns, pitch rises from the first to the second syllable, while it drops from monosyllabic nouns to a following definite article, bo. What this graph from Kaplow shows is that stress is primarily conveyed by means of high pitch and not so much intensity. This is very clear for both Balti and Amdo in the opposite peripheries of the Tibetic language continuum. So in non-tonal Tibetic varieties, in the opposite peripheries, the vast majority of disyllabic nouns, more than 95%, I counted for Burik, are stressed on the second syllable. This stress is primarily conveyed by means of high pitch. If we reconstruct the LH stress for Proto-Tibetan, this explains why in tonal dialects the second syllable is never lower than the first, as noticed by Kaplan. She writes that, in my view, the tone patterns observed on disyllabic words in many dialects of Tibetan can be explained diachronically as a combination of two processes. In part, the possible tone patterns are constrained by an acoustic template inherited from the stress patterns of Proto-Tibetan. Specifically for disyllabic nonverbs, a historical second syllable stress pattern has yielded only LH and HH tone patterns. Syllable 2 can never have a low tone. This restriction on syllable 2 tone is a direct reflection of the acoustic history of disyllabic nonverbs. As reconstructed in section 6.2, nonverbs in Proto-Tibetan were stressed on syllable 2, and the stress was conveyed primarily by fundamental frequency. This prominence of fundamental frequency on syllable 2 has evidently been quite robust and has persisted over time, even as its function changed, and regardless of variations in pitch or tone in syllable 1. This syllable 2 pitch prominence is now manifested in the innovative dialects as a syllable 2 high tone. In this way, Proto-Tibetan stress patterns are reflected in and even constrain the tone patterns observed in the modern spoken innovative dialects. Superimposed on this templatic tone are the consonantal edge effects discussed by Matisov, Mazudon, and others, which I suggest operate from both ends of a word towards its middle, just as they do on monosyllabic words. That is, the erosion of word initial consonants induces a high-low register contrast on the initial syllable. The erosion of word final consonants induces a level falling contour contrast on the final syllable, and so on. While I agree entirely with Nancy's explanation, I am not sure whether it was that simple for tone to become phonemically distinctive. So I'm just going to try to make things a little bit more explicit there. Given that the Proto-Tibetan LH stress of disyllabic nonverbs, how did tone become distinctive outside of disyllabic nonverbs? For example, in monosyllabic words, but also in the first syllables of plurisyllabic words. Could tone have become distinctive in the first syllables of disyllabic words? This actually sounds rather implausible. Voiced ga was already low to begin with, so we would have to assume that voiceless ga was raised. But this would have lowered the pitch difference between the two syllables, which likely served as a model for the two tone registers. what would you call such a process when an entity X is modeled after an entity Y, and X at the same time destroys entity Y, its model? I think it's much like this, to assume that it became distinctive in the first syllables of disyllabic words. It's much more plausible to me that tone became distinctive in monosyllabic words before it became distinctive in first syllables of disyllabic words. But then again, was it enough for there to be two distinct tone levels in disyllabic words in order for monosyllabic words with voiceless and voiced initials to be reanalyzed as respectively having a high or low tone? Or was there maybe a different trigger? Hypothesis 2 involves prefixed nasals and liquids, which in Lhasa Tibetan developed high tones, while unprefixed nasals and liquids developed low tones, as Jackson Sun shows for Lhasa. So we could hypothesize that sesquisyllabic words of the form khna received the LH stress in analogy to disyllabic words. And after losing their prefix, their high pitch is analyzed as distinctive. But then again, there's not much evidence for the productivity of the LH pattern. So could it have been a more general phonetic process which raised syllables following nasals and liquids? Are nasals pronounced with a higher pitch when preceded by a fricative prefix because their articulation builds on a pre-existing level of tension? Some of Huang Bufan's 1995 findings may point in this direction. Does anyone know of another study that may play a role here? Bufan discusses an Amdo dialect with natural but no phonemic tones, and shows that prefix nasals have a high tone, whereas naturally high tone, whereas unprefixed nasals have a low tone. Even if such details may be difficult or impossible to reconstruct, the Tibetic tonogenesis wonderfully illustrates the graduality of phonological changes, as it allows us to recognize how tone becomes distinctive in one after another group of words. And I'm going to skip the summary of this so you have some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Wow, thanks so much, Marius, for that great presentation, and also new proposal, I believe, for tonogenesis in that part of the world. And I see Nancy, so Nancy is here also. So great. So I'm not going to make any comment because I think there are other scholars who are more more expert in this than myself, and so I'll just open the room. Please unmute yourself and then comment.
I had a quick question. I'm sure Nancy has some questions, but this is Christine Hildebrandt talking. And thank you for your talk. It's so interesting, especially because I feel sometimes I'm working with either languages that are mind-boggling, or else I need to keep thinking about how I approach measuring the modern reflexes. So I'm thinking of Nubri and Gyalsumdo. Nubri seems to have patterns that are like Kiram as a modern reflex. So that's interesting, but Gyalsumdo, from all of the measurements I've gathered, it seems to look more like a Lhasa modern system. So there's no voicing, no pre-voicing, no acoustic evidence whatsoever of voicing of initial stops in what would be considered the modern reflexes of unprefixed voiced and prefixed voiced, but they do carry lower fundamental frequency, but for all measurements I've done, it seems like a single low tone. So Gyalsumdo seems like it's emerged as a 3-tone system with no voicing at all on the initials. So maybe it's gone rogue
Is it a comment or a question?
Kind of both, I guess. I'm just
Okay.
waiting for Marius to get, so I'll stop talking and see what he has to say about that.
Okay.
I don't have much to say about that, but thanks a lot, Christine. Yeah, there's a lot of different various dialects to consider, and I know I don't have the answers for all the questions I raised, but I think we know a few things, and it would be, and I think it's also impossible to reconstruct everything, the history of all these things, but maybe we can find out a few things if we work together.
Yes, I'm happy to keep talking with you about this topic another time if you're interested.
Sure, I'll be happy to.
Yes, Nancy, I'm sure you have some questions and comments. Oh, Nancy.
Oh, yeah, here I am. Actually, that was a lot, Marius, and it went by kind of quickly for me at this time of day. So I'll have to take a look more closely at the examples that you had. You had a lot of different languages there, and or a couple. So, but I was really interested in seeing the Dege and what that led you to, how that led you to rethink things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really wonderful analysis of Katrin Hasler. I love it.
Yeah, it was really nice.
And
anyone else? Actually, I'm interested in what something you said about prefix, how they help maintain the voicing of the onset. And so, I mean, the interpretation in Tibeto-Burman is that the loss of S causative prefix resulted in like Burmese aspiration and a lot of Kukichin aspiration. I wonder you want to comment on that. So the point is that you know, we have this Proto-Tibeto-Burman S causative prefix that has been lost in other languages, but they have effect on some word pairs that they have, you know, the S prefix cause aspiration in those, you know, causative pair. So Burmese will be like to drop will be like tia, and but to and to drop someone will be chia, right? So chia is like the result of that S causative prefix.
I know that in Dege, Katrin Hasler also shows that the S prefix caused the nasals, it devoiced nasals. So it's na. She transcribes it with a superscribed H. Yeah, that's one. And in others, it may have just raised the pitch, I think, together with the other prefixes. But yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So your finding does not negate that theory about aspiration in these languages?
No, I wouldn't do anything like that. No.